All right, so I am so excited to introduce Drew Delutio. Drew and I met about a year ago, and I was so excited to bring him on board and have him share his wealth of knowledge about restorative. And I'm going to just turn it over to him very quickly. But one thing that you will not see on his bio is Drew is a bona fide rock star, and he has toured in a band, and he is available for wedding gigs on the side. So he plays the guitar, sings, what else? The drums. So maybe later, if you want to meet at a bar and go jam with Drew, I'm sure he'll be available. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Drew, and I did not do a great job on that.
I think you did a great job. Thanks, Amy. So like Amy said, my name's Drew Delutio, and I taught high school in MPS for about 10 years before I transitioned into the role that I hold currently, which is basically to coordinate restorative practices in Milwaukee Public Schools from our district's violence prevention program, which also handles all of the trauma-sensitive training, social and emotional learning in the district. So we do a lot of work around supporting administrators and teachers and schools in general in creating more trauma-sensitive environments and facilitating professional developments around all of the strategies that go into creating trauma-sensitive environments for our students. So it's much different from what I previously did, and I genuinely miss the classroom a lot every day because I didn't realize how my battery was recharged by my relationship with my students. And so that's been kind of there's been a learning curve associated with that. I feel really genuinely kind of humbled to be here with you tonight. And before I start, I want to just remind you that I really think the work you do is incredibly valuable. And I realized when I was in the classroom that one of the things that I really struggled with a lot was how I didn't hear that enough. You know, especially from even my own colleagues and my own peers, and didn't take a lot of time to stop and appreciate just how influential we are in the lives of, you know, all children. But I want you to know that I appreciate you, and I feel like the collective wisdom in this room tonight is super humbling. So please don't assume that I'm an expert on this, because I'm going on this like incredible journey, and I'll be on this journey the rest of my career, but I'm going to do my best to try and share what I've learned with you. And I kind of wanted to make sure that you felt comfortable to just sort of ask questions throughout the presentation. So, you know, feel free to shout it out or raise your hand or whatever, but please don't, you know, politely wait for me to stop talking, because I'll just go. But please make sure that you feel inclined to ask any questions that you have, and I'll try to pause at intervals and ask for those as often as possible. I want to share two stories with you before we get moving to just contextualize this work. My wife and I recently moved out of Milwaukee for the first time in our adult lives with our 3 young children. And a heating repair person came to our house to explain our how the boiler works in our new house to me. And as is the case often, when he asked me what I did, and I told him I worked for the violence prevention program in Milwaukee Public Schools, his eyes got sort of wide. And he said, you know, like, oh man, that must be intense. And I was like, yeah, that is. It is intense sometimes. And he said, you know, how do you feel about, like, arming teachers? And I was like, whoa, man, this guy cut right to the chase. And he kind of really eloquently explained to me how he felt about school safety. I was really impressed. Like, he had obviously spent a lot of time formulating an opinion about what it means to keep children safe in school. And so he started explaining to me, like, I feel like, what you do is so necessary, because if the adults at, Stoneman Douglas, like, or if the police department, or if anyone had intervened and, done something about that kid who brought a gun to school and killed 17 other kids and adults, that wouldn't have happened. And I was listening to him, and I was honestly, I had called in to work that day. I needed to deal with this, and I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting this at all. This person who really wanted to engage on this topic right then and there. And I was like, yeah, let's do this. Let's talk about this. And by the time he was finished, he said, and something could have been done. They could have locked him up. And I don't want to insinuate that that was what I was expecting him to say, but it also didn't surprise me. And at this point in my career, I really genuinely wish it would have. But he had such a really informed opinion about what support looks like in schools. Only the very last thing was him falling back on a punitive form of discipline that we're really phenomenally good at in our society. A couple of years ago, or not a couple of years ago, a lot sooner than that, I think it was maybe last year, I was at a school where a pretty serious altercation had taken place, and a student had assaulted a teacher. And the teacher was injured, and just, it was genuinely a violent encounter. And after it had happened, the kid didn't run out of the school, didn't like steal the teacher's wallet and run out of the building. The kid ran into another teacher's classroom and hid there until the police came to the building and arrested the kid and hauled him off to juvenile detention. So, like, what do these two stories have in common? Aside from violence in schools, they both involve a compliance-based discipline model working to the T. Exclusionary-based discipline. So if we go back to like the story with the guy who was coming to repair our boiler, when he asked me how I felt about arming teachers, like I had to be honest. I had to say like, I sort of categorically don't agree with that. And here's why. Because I believe that trusting relationships are the bedrock of everything that we do in education. And that building that relationship should be the foundational element of every functional school, intentionally building that relationship. And that the presence of like firearms or at the very least punitive forms of discipline suggests that there are ways to be excluded from this environment. And if you push too hard, we'll do it to you. So I believe really strongly that schools are places where kids need to feel that they belong, period. And that engendering that sense of belongingness in everyone is our job as educators, especially in public schooling, but I would argue that schooling in general has to look that way, because if school isn't a place where you feel belong, or like you belong, you will find a place to belong. And oftentimes those other places aren't nearly as supportive and meaningful as our school families can be. So, that being said, I'm going to find my clicker. I'm going to do that a lot tonight. I want to talk about relationships really quickly. Everybody already knows all this stuff. Like, there's probably not going to be a lot of stuff that I say tonight that you don't maybe haven't heard before or don't already know. The real key point is, like, how do you take all this stuff and go back to your schools and make things happen? And like at this point in my career, that's what I'm really interested in. Like we can change hearts and minds and inspire people to be like, yeah, that made me feel really good. Like sitting in circle felt great. I loved that. But unless people are walking back into their schools and actually enacting meaningful change and using strategies to more intentionally build relationships and community with kids, that inspiration doesn't mean anything. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is leave you with some strategies that you can turn around and use tomorrow when you go back to school to start practicing some of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight. What's the data say, right? Strong relationships are the foundational element of school success. Believe it or not, one of the strongest predictors of academic success that we all already understand is that, hey, if a student perceives that an adult doesn't like them, they're not going to learn in that adult's classroom. Like, learning is not something that you do to a kid. It's a process that's facilitated after a child feels as if they have enough of a trusting relationship to engage in the learning process with an adult. And again, to some degree, I feel that we all understand this at some level. So then, why use restorative practices to do this, to create these really meaningful relationships? There's a lot of information out there at this point around why we would use restorative practices, and I just tossed some of it up here, and it's a lot of the stuff that you hear, being associated with all sorts of social and emotional strategies, right? Increased graduation rates, increased daily average attendance, you've got kids that academically achieve, you've got kids that can resolve conflict more appropriately. It increases the general school climate. You're not writing as many discipline referrals. You're not dealing with as many classroom disruptions and fighting. Racial disproportionality decreases and all that good stuff. Okay, but why is that? And what does it look like when it's working? So I want to do a little exercise with you really quickly. You don't have to get up or do anything. You just have to think. If you want to close your eyes, you can close your eyes, but you don't have to if you don't want to. I'd like you to just imagine someone in your life and try to get out of school for a second. It doesn't have to be a kid or a colleague. I want you to imagine an individual in your personal life who you would work to preserve your relationship with at all costs. Like when stuff gets heavy, you work through that and take a relationship-centered approach to resolution of that conflict. What do you sound like when you're working through that conflict? Like, what's your body language insinuating? How do you act with that person? Now, those are all deeply personal questions that only you can answer. But my argument here is this. Each of you is already restorative. Restorative practices are not, or restorative philosophy is not something that human beings need to learn. It's something that we do in the most functional, healthy relationships that we have in our lives. What restorative practices asks us to do is take what we do in those relationships naturally, and I shouldn't say, what each of you do in those relationships, and apply it intentionally to the building, repair, protection of all your relationships. So in that way, restorative practices is not really, it's not really about fixing kids. It's not about changing behavior. It's about taking a look at the way that we respond when things get difficult, the way that we perceive behavior, and changing that. I'm a recovering punitive disciplinarian. And I was super good at that on the front end of my teaching career. Like, I was so good at it that I could use my voice and my presence to intimidate high schoolers into doing what I wanted them to do. And I was so good at it that if an administrator walked into my classroom and saw my kids all seated in rows, quiet, looking at me, I got an exemplary evaluation, right? Unfortunately for me, it took a little while to realize that I wasn't doing my kids. I guess I was doing them a disservice. There are a lot of kids from my teaching career that I wish I could go back and apologize to, genuinely. I got into a lot of kids' faces and used my presence to demand compliance at the expense of their education and my relationship with them. And I genuinely regret that, because I feel like there was another way. And I discovered that way later on in my career, but unfortunately it took me a while to do that. Restorative practices helps us to do what comes naturally with some people to everybody. It provides us with a roadmap to intentionally do the things that come easily with one or two people with everyone. So I want to give you just a definition of restorative practices generally. And this is definitely going to be reinforced by the book that you're working out of. So the underlying principle of restorative practices is this. It's that people are happier, more cooperative, generally, more productive, and more likely to make positive changes when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to or for them. Now, what does it look and sound like to do things with students, colleagues? That's what we want to kind of go into. Okay, any questions so far? Nothing I've said has been groundbreaking, right? Perfect. Here's the definition. Restorative practices is a framework that emphasizes the value of relationships, period. And if we could probably just stop there with the definition and that would be enough, right? Relationships are the central, important bridge that connects all of us and acts as a conduit for information, right? So it's founded on the belief that a really high level of accountability, right? Something that we're really good at in our sort of punitive, compliance-driven models that we use in a lot of schools, and a high level of support combine to promote a safe and equitable environment. The framework itself, the restorative practices framework, includes a continuum of practices for building community and repairing relationships when harm has occurred. So the operative phrase there is high accountability and high support. We're awesome at high accountability. We're really good at it. That's why we incarcerate so many people. Real talk, right? We're not really good at providing people with an equally high amount of support, especially so that they can learn how to function in the societies that we want them to be equal members of. And we'll get back to that point in a minute. So if you walked into a school and that school said, we are a flagship school for restorative practices, like what would you feel? What would that place look like? And what would it sound like? Okay? That's what this information is all about. If you were going to create a really restorative school climate, your entire building would understand that building relationships is central to creating healthy communities. That would be a priority. It would be the most important priority. Relationships are strengthened by focusing on harm done rather than on rules alone. Okay? And we'll talk about rules in a minute. Number 3, focus is shifted from behavior to an individual's needs. Within restorative practices or restorative philosophy, there is a belief that behavior, particularly challenging behavior, is an indicator of an unmet need. And that our goal as practitioners is to identify what that need is. All voices are valued, and everyone is heard. We don't all have to agree. And we also don't have to come to consensus. I don't want anybody to think that like a restorative community is one where every issue is discussed collectively and we have to come to agreement. No, it's about equity of voice. Everyone feels as if they have an opportunity to speak and that they're listened to. Collaborative problem solving is promoted. And then finally, what was mentioned earlier in the definition, there's an emphasis on doing things with other people instead of to or for them. Okay? Now, any questions so far? Okay. So, I mentioned earlier that I used a lot of really punitive disciplinary techniques early on in my career, like demanding compliance from students and believing that that was what my classroom needed to look like in order for it to be considered like a functional place where learning can occur. So one of the things that I challenge all of you to do right now is take a look at this chart. How many of you are familiar with this chart? Okay. So just two of you. Are you able, do you feel like you're able to, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you feel like you're able to kind of, oh.
Spoke to this a little bit. Yes.
Are you sure they were colleagues of mine? All right. They are colleagues of mine, probably. This social discipline window drives everything that we do in MPS around restorative practices. The idea is that the first thing that we need to do in order to figure out whether or not we're prepared to do this work is all this internal reflection. Like, what do I look and sound like when I engage in a conflict with someone? Like, conflict is inevitable, right? It's part of our, I don't know, our biology. The existence of conflict in a community shouldn't be an indicator that things are wrong. And I think sometimes the compliance model sort of suggests that. Conflict is a barrier. It's an indicator that stuff isn't working, so we need to figure out what to do to make sure that conflict goes away. Nope, not going to happen. Conflict is an opportunity. And if you're viewing conflict through the restorative lens, you begin to look at it as an opportunity to build better relationships, right? Kids are going to disagree. They're going to fight. They need to learn how to navigate those conflicts effectively, and you can use them as an opportunity to build trust and to teach empathy. And the social discipline window is the beginning of that process. So if you take a look at it, it's basically divided up into 4 different quadrants. On the vertical axis is accountability. And on the horizontal axis is support. So for example, if you're operating from the, we call it colloquially the 2 box, or the punitive box, you've got a ton of accountability in your system. But you can see down here you're really low on support. So up here in the 2 box, what does this kind of look and sound like? There's a lot of punishment that goes on in the 2 box. There's a lot of like demanding compliance from people. Sort of like the drill sergeant model. Down in the lower left-hand side, you'll see the not box. Right? The not box is characterized by a really low amount of accountability and a really low amount of support as well. It's the neglectful box. Sometimes colloquially we call it the burnout box. It's where people land from the punitive box. And in a lot of schools that are high-stress environments, you see teachers bouncing back and forth between those 2 boxes all day. Compliance, 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 and then the not box. Compliance, not box. Kids swearing in the hallway, teacher walks by, not box. The 4 box, a really high amount of support and a really low amount of accountability, right? That's sort of like the overindulgent grandparent who can't really get their grandkids to do anything when the rubber hits the road, but they're really good at making them feel good. What we want to do is get to the with box. That's the restorative quadrant. And so I want to give you some strategies to sort of help you do that. Where do you, does anybody have any guess or like kind of want to put themselves out there and explain where they think they fall in the social discipline window day to day? Who said everywhere? Amy, was that you? Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the overarching message here, is that each of us, depending on who we're interacting with and the context of those interactions, will be all over the place every day in the social discipline window. So a lot of what I'm about to share with you is about getting more intentionally into the with box more often. Like, how do we get our numbers up? But you're always going to default to the compliance, or I shouldn't say compliance, but generally like the quadrant that you were kind of raised in. I grew up in this really big Italian family, and like arguing about things was how we did stuff. I have 5 brothers and sisters, and we sat around the dinner table, and that's where we hashed everything out. And if you didn't like put yourself out there and yell and gesticulate often, like no one was going to listen to you. So when I get frustrated, that's where I land, in the 2 box. And if I wasn't really cognizant of that, I didn't understand that about myself, that's where I would operate from in perpetuity. I have to understand that I land in the 2 box and I can do stuff that gets me into the with box more intentionally. Okay? All right. So how do we do this? We use what's called restorative language. Is anyone familiar generally with like love and logic, things like that? Okay. Is anyone willing to provide just like a 1-sentence like summary of like love and logic? Like, this is what it's meant to do. Go ahead. Yeah. Yes, it puts the onus back on the kid. Jen, thank you. Yeah, and there's a lot of intentional language that you use with love and logic to do that. So we're going to talk about some of those strategies, but I wanted to bring that up because some of you who are in elementary schools might be familiar with this style of communication, and it's been rebranded all over the place in a number of different social and emotional programs or curricula. So you may be familiar with it, okay? Does everyone have that Miss Johnson sheet in front of them? Did you get that when you came in? Talk about poor Miss Johnson. All right. Go ahead and pull that out for a second. So I'll read it really quickly here. And this is part of a training that we have in MPS around restorative language. And I probably should have explained this earlier, but all of this material has really been delivered in our district within the context of creating trauma-sensitive environments for kids. And a lot of that is based on all of the research that many of you are probably familiar with around the impact of trauma on children, specifically in urban areas, but not isolated to urban areas, and how that impacts behavior. So, Miss Johnson is a social studies teacher, and I'd like to know if someone's willing to read that scenario out loud at the top of the page. Is anybody willing to read it out loud? Because let me just jump in and do it. Awesome, thank you so much. Here you go.
In Miss Johnson's social studies class, students are working independently analyzing a document. Miss Johnson is walking around the class answering student questions. She notices Andre and Maria whispering to one another and playing around on Maria's cell phone.
Okay, thank you so much. Who's familiar with this scenario? Does this hit close to home, or is everybody like, what is cell phones in the classroom? People are still doing that? That's still an issue? So this is how Miss Johnson responds right off the bat. This is what she says. She approaches Andre and Maria and starts talking to them about the game they're playing on Maria's cell phone. Not bad. She asks them if they need help on the assignment, but does not address the cell phone issue. Andre and Maria say no. They continue to play with the cell phone, and Miss Johnson walks away. What box is she operating out of? What is that? The 4 box. Right. How do we know that? She pays attention. She shows that she cares, but she doesn't do anything about the behavior, right? Why isn't it neglect? Yeah, absolutely. She engages with the kid and is kind and also maybe even listens if they're willing to explain what they're doing on the phone. But yeah, she doesn't address the behavior. That's the 4 box, absolutely. Miss Johnson walks up to Andre and Maria demanding that they give her the cell phone that they're using. The students refuse, and Miss Johnson loudly recites the school's cell phone policy. If you've got a cell phone policy. Ensuring that the rest of the class can hear her. Oh, that's interesting. This causes an argument, and Andre and Maria are sent out of the class. What box? 2 box. How do we know that? High accountability, low. Yeah, absolutely. Did anybody latch on to something that Miss Johnson did in that description? That was really interesting. Anybody pick up on something that was really interesting? You're like, why did Miss Johnson do that? Go ahead. Oh yeah, the compass of shame. Yeah, there's the public shaming for sure. That certainly doesn't help. What else did she do? Okay, so she said she intimidated everyone else with her, reading the policy. Here's the interesting thing about this response, right? And I feel like teachers understand this intimately, right? Like, when a kid doesn't comply, it puts an incredible onus on you as the teacher to do something, right? It took me years to figure out that that's not the way it's supposed to be. If you think about it for a second, there's heavily armed police officers who try to demand compliance from people and can't get it. Why do we as educators place the burden of compliance on ourselves? Because I feel like it burns us out. Miss Johnson can't do anything to get Andre and Maria to comply with her rule. If they choose not to, it's not going to happen. So what does she do? She loudly recites the cell phone policy out of fear that the other kids in the class are going to do what Andre and Maria did. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Because I did that for a long time as a teacher. By the time a kid was non-compliant, my biggest fear was that the rest of my class was going to follow suit. And I would lose control, there'd be chaos, my colleagues would identify me as a poor teacher and in need of support, and I would go into the mentoring program, and before you know it, I'd be kicked out of the profession. The compliance model burns us out. We'll come back to it. Miss Johnson ignores Andre and Maria's behavior, thinks to herself, if they don't care about this class, it's on them. Box? It's the not box. And she's probably been operating out of the 2 box for a long time at that point. So what do you see when you walk into Miss Johnson's class? Everybody's doing their own thing. She's maybe teaching to 2 or 3 kids. There's kids standing up in the back of the room. There's people moving around. Kids are streaming out into the hallway, whatever. And you've got a big problem. Down at the bottom of that page, it asks you to craft a restorative response. This is why I mentioned love and logic earlier, because some of you may be familiar with this. Now, suspend your disbelief if you haven't already, and just follow me on this and see if you agree with what I'm about to say. From the restorative facilitator or restorative practitioner's perspective, what's going on here is Miss Johnson's missing an opportunity, A, to build a relationship with Andre and Maria, using the conflict over the cell phone as an opportunity to do that, and B, make a withdrawal from the emotional bank account that she's invested in over the course of that school year. So we say the Miss Johnson should really dive in with an affective statement or affective statement. And this should be part of what Miss Johnson does in her class. Now I'm going to read this really briefly, and then I want to ask your opinion about it. So a really effective affective statement is an expression of someone's personal feelings based on an observation. This does not come naturally to a lot of people. And we'll talk in a minute about why that is. I think it especially doesn't come naturally to educators. We begin with an I statement, and we describe a feeling, and then we connect that feeling to a specific action. When I hear you talking at the same time I'm talking, I feel frustrated because I'd like to be heard. I feel like elementary school teachers do this fairly regularly. At high school, it starts to wane a little bit. I don't know why that is. I mean, I have some theories about why that is. Does using this kind of language make you feel uncomfortable? Why not? Maureen. Of course I picked the social worker in the room. Yeah. The social workers in our office joke that they operate from the 4-box often, but that's just kind of where they live.
It's the journey from going through, I am declaring this is my space, I am the teacher, I have the knowledge. And when you say I feel, there's this perception that that is vulnerability.
Yes.
Approachable.
Yeah, vulnerability, that's what it's about. So building trusting relationships is rooted in our ability to be vulnerable with children. In a compliance-based system, that's sort of paradoxical. At least I feel to some extent. Being vulnerable is difficult. I mean, being genuinely vulnerable, right? I mean, you're putting yourself out there. And she's still going to be afraid of what the rest of the class is going to do. Imagine if she says that to Andre and Maria in front of the whole class. You know, I feel really hurt that you're using the cell phone. I spent a lot of time on this lesson, and your education is really important to me. And Andre and Maria say, I don't care. I'm going to keep doing this. My argument here is that if you're able to deliver I statements genuinely, it requires practice, but it also requires you to believe that delivering the I statement plants the seed to foster and engender a sense of empathy and trust in a child. This is what restorative practitioners do all the time. Use I statements when conflict occurs, but more importantly, using I statements and affective language on the front end, constantly. There's basically a theory that says you should probably use 5 affective statements for every 1 withdrawal statement that you make from somebody's emotional bank account, right? I'm so glad you're here. I feel so happy that you made it to class today, and our classroom community isn't complete without you. And saying that to a kid whose behavior is really challenging requires you to be a phenomenal actor or actress. For sure, right? You're not going to like everybody every day, right? So if this is the affective statement, I think the biggest takeaway here is that it's much easier to practice this language in the absence of conflict. The affective statement is still really beneficial when conflict occurs, but if this becomes the way that you speak all the time and you're modeling that with your students, it has a profound effect when conflict does occur. And we'll talk about why this is important within the context of the circle process in a minute. Any questions so far? Any pushback so far? Go ahead.
Are you going to get to the, okay, so you do this all right and the kid still tells you to F off, fuck off? I can say it. Because that's good. I mean, I think all of us probably have that kid that's still going to, so hopefully you'll get to then what do you do, right?
What do you think?
It really depends on the kid, right? So it really depends on the kid. So with some kids, you just take them out of the room and sit them down outside and have a conversation. Some of them you just say, okay, we need a little space from each other. You let them kind of sit and do their thing and deal with it later. Some of them get really escalated. You need to send them out of the room. I mean, it's so situational, but I think that's always going to be the pushback to methods like this. So what do you do with that? And I know it's the rare kid. Not him. Okay. But I think that's one of the things we're going to need to take back to our faculty. Like, what do you do with those kids? And then the other thing I'm wondering about is, I know that we're not supposed to teach kids to be compliant, but I teach a government class, and one of the things I do want to teach kids is to be compliant with the police. I mean, I think we've all had that kid where you're like, oh my gosh, if he goes off like that to a police officer, he's gonna get shot, arrested. So there's like a whole nother lesson set, and maybe that's separate from this, that I guess I need some tools with those few really angry kids. How do you get them to understand that, well, I want to work with you with this relationship sometimes out there, you just need to be compliant. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely makes sense, and there's a couple of layers that you're hitting on there. Last night, I did another training with the Midnight Basketball League and MPS with their coaches around restorative language and conflict resolution. If you're not familiar with that program, it's open to like young men between 19 and 25, a lot of whom like have been incarcerated and are coming back into the community and like need mentors and opportunities to sort of, anyway, it's a great program. And one of my co-trainers for that is a Milwaukee police officer. And we were having a conversation before the training because like I was chewing his ear about what's going on in MPD, and we do some training sometimes for MPD, and he was kind of talking to me about our suspension and expulsion issues in MPS, and I was like, I feel Delmar, I feel for you because like, you got to teach the guys that you're coaching like how to interact with the police, because unfortunately that's something that they're going to have to navigate. And he was like, we do that constantly, and they listen because they don't want to get handcuffed, they don't want to get tossed in the back of a squad car. And he told me like, sometimes like, some of my guys are just on a mission, meaning some of the police officers that he oversees, and they don't want to listen. They're not interested in him being compliant. I thought it was an interesting perspective coming from like a police officer in Milwaukee, that like, from his perspective, oftentimes it was an adult problem. I want to go back to like what you said about those, in PBIS language, like tier 3, the kids who require tier 3 support. Not tier 3 kids, like the kids who require those tier 3 interventions. One of the things that we struggle with in Milwaukee Public Schools is acknowledging that our tier 1 community development needs to be better. And unfortunately, in the absence of tier 1 community development across the board, a lot of our students end up with tier 2 and tier 3 support when they shouldn't. And so I think that in a lot of ways, one of the things that restorative language at least does sort of generally is create a baseline in every classroom and in every space in that school to help us sort of identify like, okay, we're all doing everything in our power to intentionally build relationships with kids every day. Now, who's still in need of more intervention? And I think that that can still, obviously there are still places in which you'll have large numbers of kids at the 2 and 3 level. But I also, so that's one pseudo answer. But the other thing that I think is really important as well is also acknowledging what is a behavior issue. Because I think in my own experience, one of the things that I learned over the course of working teaching in a high school for a long period of time was that there were a lot of things that I perceived as behavior issues that were really like classroom managed stuff that I didn't really have procedures around. And I think that's where impromptu conferencing comes in, because I think that'll really help you practice a kind of language when stuff really does get difficult and behavior gets difficult, to keep the relationship that you hopefully have with a kid at the center of what you do, and also to use the conflict as an opportunity to build a better relationship. It's a really good segue into this, because hopefully this is something you can turn around and do or start practicing immediately. So the small impromptu conference is something that we really strive to promote in Milwaukee Public Schools as a way to standardize the way that we handle disciplinary issues, classroom managed disciplinary issues, to ensure that relationship development is still at the forefront of what we're doing. What is a small impromptu conference? It's brief. It expresses emotions. It allows you to practice affective statements. It's empowering. It allows students to discuss a situation and provides them with an opportunity to own what it is that happened. Generally, they can keep a problem from escalating. It really helps us to address harm done and its impact on a community rather than compliance to a rule. And we don't ask anybody why they did anything. Was it you that mentioned shame earlier? What do you think the connection is between asking a kid why they did something and shame? Because I know you can answer this.
So I'm a school counselor. Yeah. And so you're always told in counseling not to say, well, why do you feel that way? Why do you, because it implies a sense of, that's stupid. Why do you feel that way? And that's rather than tell me what you were feeling, like when this happened. Walk me through that rather than the other.
Yeah, that's spot on, right? So I'm gonna take a step back and go from the perspective of the social discipline window, right? We already kind of acknowledged that I land in the 2 box when I get frustrated and upset. The question why is generally associated with that feeling of frustration. Like even when I ask my own kids at home why they did stuff, like believe it, I'm not restorative all the time, right? That's about me. That's about me. In a lot of instances, and I'm not saying that this is true for you. In a lot of instances when I do that, it's about me trying to shame my kids. Why did you color on the wall? He's 4 years old. He doesn't know why he colored on the wall. He just did it. Why'd you punch Devontae? Because he got in my face. I don't know. I just did it. And especially through the lens of trauma, the question why becomes this deal breaker. Like not only am I not going to tell you why, because I don't know why I did it, but you don't want to listen to me. You don't want to know why I did this. There were so many kids when I was in the classroom who sometimes would explain back to me, like, you don't want to listen to me, as I was kind of spouting off about how upset I was about this behavior. Why'd you do this? Why'd you get in his face? I'm Mr. D, I'm not going to talk to you. Get out of my face. The absence of the why question is huge. What happened? What happened? And not what happened when the conflict has just occurred, especially when a kid is super dysregulated. After you're in your thinking brain, you've got an opportunity to calm down. What happened? When we talk about empowering kids, this is what we mean, right? I want to hear your narrative. This is tough. This can be really tough, especially when you saw something happen and you know from your perspective, with your highly developed brain and access to your prefrontal cortex, just how egregious that behavior was. To not get in there and try and lecture a kid on, this is why what you did was the worst thing in the world. And by the way, you're on your path, to becoming a horrible human being. What happened? And at the very least, what that question engenders is a sense of trust. This adult wants to listen to me and isn't passing judgment on the front end regarding what I've done. What happened? Start at the beginning. Who's been affected by what you've done? What do you think you need to do to make things right? What support do you need in order to do it? Fix what you did. And let me help you do that. But in the absence of a community and in the absence of healthy relationships, is there any motivation to fix what you did? Probably not, because you don't have any relationships to fix. So again, we're sort of in a paradoxical situation. We need to have functional relationships and trusting relationships and healthy community so that kids can fix those things when conflict occurs. If conflict is occurring and you try the impromptu conferencing and nobody wants to participate, that's probably an indicator that there's no community to repair. Nobody here cares about me. I don't belong in this space. I'm looking out for myself. And this is how I need to operate in this environment to protect myself. It begins with trust. And it begins with the trust shared between two people. Listening, assuming good intent, listening with respect, non-judgment, opportunities to share stories and narratives. I think one of the things that oftentimes is missing from the classroom is honoring the stories that are brought to that space by children. And this kind of gets back into the compliance model of education. Exactly. Because if you don't share your own story, how do you find any common values with another kid in their story? And that's the goal, right? What I value is reflected in my story, and what you value is reflected in yours. And what we need to do is identify what those values are. Then we have a trusting relationship. And then we can also fix something. Go ahead, sorry.
No, my concern is I totally understand like sharing a story and trying to be relatable. But in this, I'm just asking this question because I see that, but then I also see it's not about us in that moment. And so me, who looks like this, talking, depending on who I'm talking to, I feel like, no, it's not. I'm a white middle-class woman if you look at me walking down the street. So, well, hey, yeah, thank you. That it's not like we can't, right? We can't always do that. It's not always appropriate and in the best interest of the student because that could be a barrier So if a student is really upset and there's just this horrific home situation, yeah, I had a rough home situation, but it wasn't that home situation. And so I think that there's a way to say, to validate feelings without making it in that moment about, now I'm going to tell you about me, where it's, right. But I mean, that's what I'm saying, like in sharing stories, like sometimes it may not be received in the right, with good intentions, but like sometimes we can't, yes. So.
Amy is really good at stay on top of the microphone situation. Sorry, I'm sorry, everyone. This is spot on. Like, yeah, you're not going to do that when the conflict goes down. Like, that's not the time to share the story, for sure. And that brings us to like the importance of circles. Like intentional strategies we're using every day to honor the stories of ourselves and our students so that when conflict occurs, there's context. You don't have to share where you're from and what you believe and why that's important because that foundation has already been laid. And that's where restorative language becomes super effective, right? Because if we're sitting in circle 3 times a week and every time we sit in circle, everyone's given an opportunity to share something of value to them or what they believe or an experience, then when that inevitable conflict goes down, guess what? When you say, I feel really hurt because I really value you and appreciate you, and I worked really hard on this, that student can recall those stories. And more importantly, the values that you identified in Circle, which is what we're going to talk about next, shared agreements, values, and letting those drive the pace of a community, not rules. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I have kind of a story about how I messed that up when I first started doing this. So I'm going to pass around impromptu conferencing cards for everyone so you can stick them in your lanyard and practice them on like your pets at home and stuff, like super low, you're not going to get a lot back. You're not going to put yourself out there, but just practice saying it. If you guys could just pass them around after you're done. So, one of the things that I sort of infamously did when I first started really trying to apply restorative practices and processes to my classroom is I sat all my kids in a circle and was like, what's your deepest fear? And it was crazy. It was crazy. And I think that's one of the things that happens around restorative practices is people go to trainings and they go back into their classrooms and they sit everybody in circle and the kids are like, they won't sit, or like they throw the talking piece at each other, or like they don't give a crap about what you're talking about or the shared agreements, and then people are like, restorative practices doesn't work. It doesn't work. The compliance-based model is the only way to do things. These kids can't handle this. These kids can't. And of course that's not true. There are all these informal ways that we can reinforce this idea that relationships matter, and that's all about restorative language. But on the restorative practices continuum, there's all sorts of formal strategies that we need to use to intentionally build community, and that involves the sharing of stories and values. That's what circles are all about. Now, I'm going to come back to balance in the process in a moment, but a great restorative circle and someone who's really on top of circle facilitation and understand its purpose knows that restorative circles are all about creating a structured space for speaking and listening. This is how we do this, and this is what it looks like. We're going to promote connection with one another. That is super important, right? When we're sitting in this space, we are connecting. And you are valuable, and you are valuable, and you're all just as valuable as me, and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to hold myself to the same standards that we're all holding one another to. It gives people equal voice. It promotes cultural responsiveness. So what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? And when can you do this stuff, right? Some people use circles when they're checking in the morning with their kids, right? Classroom or staff meetings, class discussions, staff support, whatever. We facilitate circles for all sorts of stuff in MPS. And a lot of it at this point is about helping adults just understand what this looks and sounds like. Sitting in circle with adults and practicing, like using a talking piece and a centerpiece, but most importantly, developing shared agreements and going through values exercises. I still don't understand why the expectation in classrooms on day one is to start teaching content. If we can all acknowledge that relationships are the conduit through which we deliver academic content, how come in every school across this country, leaders and teachers aren't saying from day 1 to day 40, we're building community so that everything that happens on the back end is super productive? There are a bunch of different elements to the circle process that some of you might be familiar with or some of you might not be familiar with, but like sitting in circle isn't restorative. Like standing in the car or in the garage doesn't make you a car. If you put the chairs in a circle and you sit there, that's fine. And a lot of people do that when they teach. But it's not a restorative circle. A restorative circle has someone who's facilitating, some sort of ceremony that marks the beginning of that process, a centerpiece that kids and adults can use to, direct their gaze, because sometimes looking across a circle at another kid is not fun. And it's super anxiety inducing, especially if you're not used to it. using a talking piece and understanding the importance of that, and that it gives us permission to listen to one another, not to talk. Like utilizing the power of listening and reinforcing that. Guiding questions, right? This is what this is about today. And then the development of shared agreements, which I'm going to explain right now as the fundamental missing component in many of our classrooms and schools and spaces where we have developed rules that are rooted in a compliance model rather than the collective values of one another and our students. What are shared agreements? They are a set of guidelines that all participants commit to uphold in our classrooms. Where do they come from? They're rooted in the shared values that we identify in a values circle. So what is a values circle? It's a specific kind of circle that asks students to identify what they are when they're the best version of themselves. Right? And that's heavy, because a lot of kids have never even thought about that before. And some might not even possess the vocabulary to be able to say, when I'm the best version of myself, I'm compassionate. And that may require a lot of teaching on the front end, right? Here's a list of 150 different values. And here's what each one means. So the point of the values circle, to go back to what you said, is to give everyone in class the opportunity to tell their story, or at least a little piece of it. This is who I am, and this is what I bring to this space, including the teacher. Once that's done, it's the facilitator's job to take those values and turn them into shared agreements. This is who we are in this space, meaning the classroom. Those shared agreements become the way that we do things here. So now, when you walk into class late and you got a bag of chips and you sit in the back of the room and you pull your phone out and then you put your head down on your desk, it's not on me to change that. Because we already identified on the front end that you value respect. And what does respect look and sound like from your perspective? Listening. So now the entire class isn't looking at me to fix that. The entire class is looking at that student to do what we know they're capable of doing, right? What they agreed to. Is that going to change student behavior? No. It's not. I hope I didn't burst anybody's bubble. Behavior is rooted in an unmet need, some of which we can't meet. But we can take the conflict that results from that behavior and use it as an opportunity to turn those particular children into more empathic people. And sometimes you got to have a long-term goal and understand that that's not going to happen overnight. But the development of shared agreements is really going to push you in that direction. I had a kid who was in my restorative practices course at High School of the Arts who had not kicked out, but had been suspended from that place, I don't know, a handful of times. And the guy I taught across the hall from just really thought that this kid had absolutely no redeemable quality whatsoever. So what did we do? Put him in restorative practices. So he was in restorative practices and he came every morning. And one day he got into a fight with a kid in the hallway and security was escorting him out of the building. And I was walking upstairs to my classroom when security came down, and there he was, like, with a security guard on either side of him, and he's getting escorted out of the building. And he was cursing and yelling. And when he walked past me, he goes, "Mr. D, this restorative practices thing is super tough." And he got kicked out. He was gone. Compliance-based discipline model. He was gone. He wasn't a problem for the guy across the hall anymore, that's for sure. Remember Bloom's taxonomy? That's a good question. I don't know. He went to another high school in MPS that probably didn't reflect his values or... Yes. It's a possibility. But I guess the moral of the story is I don't know. And a teacher came up to me after that, and this was a teacher who had sat in circle with some of my students as well, who facilitated community building circles with the staff there. And she said, like, look, I know what you're trying to do. I know what you're doing, and like, you know, it's good. It's great. These kids need that, again, with the these kids thing. But I shouldn't have to sit in circle with him. That kid's a jerk. His behavior hasn't changed. Like, you've got a relationship with him, but when he leaves your class... And I remember standing there thinking to myself, like, yeah, this is, like, this needs to be expressed, but like, man, yeah, I do have a relationship with him. And it's not because I'm me. It's because I use a set of intentional relationship building strategies with everyone in there to have just that. And you can have it too. And that was one of the things that really like motivated me to kind of turn around and go, you know what, like maybe this is about like changing adult behavior. Maybe it's not about changing student behavior. It's about changing the way that we as adults perceive behavior. And understand that there are things that we can do proactively to build better relationships with even the toughest kids that are going to translate to learning. When that kid walked by me, everybody remember Bloom's taxonomy? He was in synthesis territory, I feel like. He's dysregulated, he's flying off the handle, and he walks past me in the hallway and he says, this restorative practices thing is really difficult. He's trying to apply what I taught him in class to a situation that's happening right in that moment. And what did we do to him? We tossed him. From my perspective, that's the issue. We didn't use that conflict as an opportunity to reinforce what he was trying to do, and that was regulate himself. How can we support him through that? Go ahead, sorry.
So I had this, I'm struggling with a belief, I guess, that you're kind of touching upon when you're talking about you don't know where the kid went, right? Like he's gone and you don't know where he went. And so I had a conversation with a teacher of emotional and behavioral disability students who had in his back pocket, like they could go away. Like so when they were too much of a pain, they could go away to our neutral site program. They'd just be gone. And we had a really tough, like, crucial conversation one day in which I said, like, until you take the option off the table, we're not going to do any real restorative problem solving. I guess I keep coming back to that. Like, if you have the option of booting the kid, do you ever really get to, like, full restorative mode if you always kind of have that in your back pocket? You know what I mean?
That's a great question. When you implement restorative practices with fidelity across an entire school, your suspension rate's going to go up. Does anybody have any theories why? Because if kids aren't used to having to fix the relationships that they've built, that's a super uncomfortable experience. And most kids will opt to leave. And we know that to be true because for a lot of kids, suspension and expulsion is nothing to be afraid of, especially in a school where you don't feel that you belong. A lot of times, we all know this, it's rewarding negative behavior, right? So when you implement restorative practices in a building, your suspension rate's going to go up in the short term. Throughout that process, what needs to be happening is everybody in that space has to be using the kind of intentional community building techniques that we just talked about, so that kids begin to understand that not only is what they value honored in that space, but we genuinely want you here. And I do not think that that is something that universally kids in our schools can say they feel. This place is not necessarily for me. It might be for you and you over there who are in advanced placement classes or doing the IB thing or whatever. But it's not for me. This space isn't for me. So if you want to expel me, that's fine. I got another tribe. One of the things that we talk about often is how when a school is moving from a punitive or compliance-based system to a restorative system, you're going to have to find a weird middle ground. Like safety, for example, is a non-negotiable. It's a non-negotiable. And in an environment where you have lots of fights and safety can't be ensured, your suspension rate is going to increase. But what we miss often is like the intentional then use of those relationship building strategies on the front end. Like a lot of times I think schools go, all right, I'll get phone calls all the time like, okay, we want restorative practices, right? Like they're looking at a menu of social and emotional learning. They're going like, nope, restorative practices, that fits. That's what we need. And I think what a lot of schools don't understand is like what that requires. Is everybody willing to make a shift, like a paradigm shift in the way they perceive behavior, that like a genuine apology rooted in a values activity and community is what you're going for? And then the opportunity for that kid to fix that relationship, because that requires a ton of processes and procedures that you probably don't have in place. It's a paradigm shift. It's an enormous shift. And outside of places like Oakland Unified and Minneapolis, where in some schools this has really taken root, a lot of people have not figured out yet how to uproot that punitive model and replace it with a new one. And that's indicative, I think, of just how enormous the shift is. But you are absolutely correct to point out that, like, if leaving is an option and not coming back is an option, I don't know if you ever really get there. But at the same time, I don't think that you can really ensure safety without that being constantly present. The key is that you do so much community building and values exercises and shared agreement development that eventually kids in the building begin to feel like, yeah, this is my space. This is where I belong. If we go back to the story from the beginning with the guy who asked me, like, you know, they would have known what was going on and locked him up before he shot up the school. That's the kind of mind that we're trying to shift. Like, how come we wouldn't have known what that kid was going through and then asked ourselves, are we doing anything to help him belong here? Does he have any opportunities to connect with other people? Or have we decided that he doesn't fit in this space? That's the problem. And I wish I had a real clear-cut answer, but that's something that I struggle with every day when I walk into schools and I see just how heavy that lifting is. We've built a lot of schools that really don't help kids feel like they belong. Everyone. And I think that's sort of paradoxical in terms of public education. In a lot of public schools, at least, I think there's a mentality that, like, a kid has to choose to learn. And if they choose not to learn, this is not your space. This is not your tribe. And that's sort of antithetical to the public school model. No, we're supposed to be educating that kid too. Go ahead. Can I start here, then go this way? Finally, I stirred you up. We have some questions.
So I'm wondering, at the middle and high school level, when you have kids going to multiple teachers throughout the day, you know, we have potentially 8 different teachers that kids see in a 2-day period. Is there a possibility of them getting circle fatigue or community fatigue, in that I went to my first hour and I did a circle and I built community, and my second hour and we did a circle and we had community agreements, and third hour, you know, because it's all different sets of kids and different combinations. How do you keep it, I guess, real for them if you're really trying to do a full school implementation?
That's a great question. Did everybody hear that? my first response is that a lot of high school teachers give tests on the same day. Kids come to school on Fridays and they got tests in like 6 classes. It's something that we already do in our present sort of more traditional model. Like, kids walk into 6 different classes during the day and everybody's teaching from the front of the room. And their behavior reflects that they're bored and they don't give a crap about what's going on in there. I believe that the circle process, yes, could it reflect that as well? Yeah, totally, right? I mean, teenagers and young children by nature are going to become bored with processes. That's sort of how their brains are wired. What I think the circle process does is allow for kids to, and again, I'm going to go back to the feelings, feel as if the adult in that room is placing like their needs and values at the forefront of everything that happens. So it engenders a sense of belongingness. I might be sick of circle, just like I'm sick of taking a test or I'm sick of going to the same cafeteria, but it starts to engender in kids a sense that even though I'm kind of tired of this process and getting cynical about it, I still feel like I belong in this space, and I'm probably not going to push back as much if the teacher's implementing it genuinely. And that's another really key, I think, understanding is that, like, if we go back to affective questions and affective statements, you got a lot of teachers who use those all the time. A lot of people who use those all the time. And I don't know about you, but like, I know when someone's techniquing me. I work in violence prevention. I know when someone's using an I statement on me. And I think sometimes it makes me angrier than somebody getting in my face. Because it's not genuine. You're using an I statement because you understand that that's the appropriate technique, but it's not rooted in any vulnerability or genuine desire to want to have your feelings honored by someone else. You can feel it when it's real, and so can a kid. And so conversely, a kid can also feel when it's a load of crap. But I think circles are like that. When we're facilitating genuine circles that involve shared agreement development, I haven't really seen a situation in my career where a kid doesn't want to go into that space. I really haven't. That's not to say that those don't exist. You're welcome. Was there a question here, Nancy? Did you have? Somebody else had their hand up. Did I? All right, sorry. John, did you have? Okay.
There may be some value in learning what happens in this alternative high schools, where they're removed from MPS. They're not allowed to go back in. Could be that young man you described. And they go into that school, and 2.5 years later in a high school, 83% of them graduate. And what's going on in that environment that's unique from the environment we're attempting to manage? No, I'm pulling on your expertise, sure, yeah, to share with the group and so the group thinking.
Sure, absolutely. Transition High School is a great example in MPS, and Alliance High School is another one. But my predecessor, who held this position before me, was the social worker at Transition High School in MPS, a place where those children who were expelled from MPS schools or incarcerated. Right, I think probably colloquially that's what I think you were talking about. Yeah. Yeah, and we've, it's been around for so long that I feel like we all call. Yes. She was, so her and then another colleague of mine were very, very, very intentional about making restorative circles the way that things were run in some of those places. And one of the interesting things that's come from that is that, granted, those buildings are filled with kids who have enormous behavioral needs in many respects. But many of them, high numbers of them, graduate from those schools. And it kind of goes to what you were saying, is it Corey, about like not being able to be kicked out anymore. Like, what do you do when that's no longer an option? And do circles help to, make those environments more conducive for those kids. I think that my colleague Heather Sattler, for example, who works at Alliance High School and does a lot of work around making that high school and MPS a place for kids who've experienced bullying or violence in other places, a really positive place. One of the critiques of those spaces, though, is that their suspension data in a lot of ways mirrors the suspension data of other high schools in MPS. And I think that what that kind of signifies is that we still haven't really changed systems to make it more difficult for people to just suspend kids. But at the same time, just we haven't shifted people's mindsets completely. We still feel like removing someone, even when safety isn't an issue, is really a better alternative than spending the time and energy to facilitate circles. And that's something that I feel like if you do any research around Oakland and what they've done, you'll see that they've put processes in place to accommodate this. Allowing teachers the time and energy necessary to do repairing harm, but also they have a lot of outside help doing that. A lot of schools in Oakland use an outside organization to do a lot of the heavy repairing harm that school staff would be burdened with, because frankly, at a building level, that's an enormous procedural change that a lot of schools just can't handle with regards to resource allocation and things like that. So you've got community partners coming in to do that. Phyllis, correct?
Okay. So early on, you said that behavior is rooted in unmet needs, some of which we cannot meet. And so I feel like I need you to acknowledge that there's still going to be suspensions and expulsions. I'm a little worried that we don't want to paint it that we'll never. I don't mean to sound like the downer, but there's those. We've all had the kid that we really thought, we had done everything right, and then they don't come to school anymore, and you find it was because they're in juvenile detention that weekend, or they don't come back, and I think it feels like a personal failure when you lose those kids. But I think we have to acknowledge that exactly what you said. I can't control what happens to them when they go back home at night, and sometimes that means we're going to lose one or two. And I feel like if we all walk out of here thinking like we can never suspend or expel or lose a kid, we're gonna just not try. I mean, if we set the bar up to perfection, then I've got a whole bunch of teachers in my school that are gonna say it's not possible. Does that make sense? I don't know.
What I'm hearing is this desire to sort of acknowledge reality, and the fact that you may put every single support necessary in a place to provide a child with the opportunity to succeed, and they might still not. Yeah, I don't have any. Not only do I have no problem acknowledging that, I feel like that is absolutely in line with the high accountability, high support model. Because at some point, we have to provide enough support for a kid to make a really informed decision about what they're going to do. And I guess what I'm arguing is that we need to ensure that community has been established and trusting relationships in our schools before we can say with certainty that we've done that. Because I would argue, based on my own experience professionally, that in many instances, people will say that to me, that we've done everything or we did everything, and in actuality, there wasn't a lot of relationship building going on, and there wasn't a community in place to welcome the kid back into. It was basically like the kid decided not to follow our rules, and now he's gone, and we gave him 4 chances to do it. Does that make sense? Because I think that, let me share another story with you about the restorative practices course. So I don't think I said this. I taught a class at High School of the Arts called Restorative Practices, and it was developed by my predecessor and myself and some other social workers and psychologists in the district to teach high school kids the fundamentals of restorative practices. And in that course, I had a student once who was transferred into the class, which unfortunately became what was like done with that class. Sometimes like some of the most students, you know, the kids who had some of the highest behavioral needs would get transferred into restorative practices, which was fine. But it meant that they had a really sort of steep learning curve. So I had one student who one day just refused to sit in circle. And was probably looking for a little bit of maybe control. He had had a very difficult transition into foster care and some other things. And around that time, he sort of came into class and said he just wasn't going to sit in circle anymore. And we had a shared agreement in that room that we would always sit in circle, regardless of how we felt, but no one was under any obligation to share. So, like classic power struggle, right? What am I going to do? What are the rest of the kids going to think if I just allow him to do this? And the kids actually suggested that they would have the circle in the hall that day. And I was like, oh, I'm okay with that. And I think that then he moved out into the hallway and like sat against a locker or something while everyone was in circle. And I had a conversation with him after that class about what we had agreed to and how if he, which I know he was, able to, embrace what he had said he wanted and was willing to do, then this was his space. But if not, he had to kind of make a decision. Like, we're here, your community, your tribe, we want you here, but you got to do what you said you were going to do. And we're here to help you if you need it. He didn't know what to do with that. And he transferred out of the class into the guy who taught next door to me into his social studies class. It was awesome. Because that's exactly what the point of the course was. You belong here, and you got to make a choice whether or not, once you've made like this agreement that this is who I am and this is what I'm going to be and I'm going to honor that in this space, can we hold you to that standard, or are you going to... So when he left, I had a conversation with the counselor that like, it's okay if he transfers back in. I'm okay with that. But before he does that, he has to come back to the class and explain what he's going to do to honor the agreements. And I had the luxury of having a really good relationship with the counselor, and like, that's another procedural thing that might not happen in a lot of schools. He was in that other class for a month with his head down. And the guy who taught next door to me, who happened to be my student teacher, would come to me every day and be like, can you get him out of there? And of course, there was nothing I could do, right? Like, he had made a choice. But I did let him back in. He did eventually come back in, and he did eventually say to the rest of the class, this is what I did, and this is why I want to be back here. And the rest of the class said, let's do it. And I know that sounds super rosy and like, utopian, but it's totally possible. And I think that to sort of wrap things up, that's where we need to get to. This idea that like, this is not pie in the sky utopian stuff. This is the way that we operate as people. And it's kind of what we need in order to feel as if we're living in healthy communities. And I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe that schools could genuinely look this way. I really do believe that they can. And there are enough examples to sort of suggest that we could all make our spaces look this way. I think the real question is like, do we want to do that? Or are we okay with excluding a small number of kids to maintain the status quo? Like, is our school built for everybody? And do we do enough to make sure that everyone understands that and has an opportunity to articulate who they are and what they need to be successful in that space? And are we going to honor that? Or is it easier to maintain the status quo and lose 10 or 15% of our population? I don't know. But hopefully you leave here thinking about that and maybe sort of going back into your classrooms and your schools and maybe starting to experiment with some of the things that I talked about and using the resources, a lot of which are in the book that you have and a lot of other books, to sort of go, you know, is there a different way to do things? Does anybody have any other questions? All right. It's about 7 o'clock on the dot. I really appreciate everything that we were able to discuss and you letting me present. And I've left my card at the back of the room on the table. So if anyone's ever interested in reaching out for more support, feel free to send me an email, and I'd love to do what I can to help you on your journey. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everything that you do. I don't know how to turn this off.
All right, so we got all of our announcements out of the way ahead of time because we are hearing your feedback and we want to make sure that you have time to work in your group. I know it's late, but we will stay here as long as you want to stay here tonight to process this and to just talk in your group, perhaps just make a plan for your poster or whatever you need. So we're here for you, and feel free to stay as long as you need. Thank you, Drew. And another round of applause for Drew.
Oh, I forgot to mention that I included in your handouts an FAQ. Thanks, Amy. An FAQ around restorative language and an FAQ around circle facilitation. And those are like accumulated questions over the course of many professional developments in MPS around this stuff that I think are really pertinent to, everybody's school, schools and classrooms. So if you have like some hesitation or stuff, read through those sheets because there's some really good questions on there and some explanations that'll hopefully, help you to feel more confident to turn around and do this stuff. So thanks again.